welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm extremely honored to introduce you Professor Michael Spence. As Nobel laureate in economy in 2001, he's a professor at Stanford. And on top, I learned he's the chairman of an independent commission, the Growth and Development, created to monitor the growth and the poverty reduction in developing countries. So it's very fascinating scientific and cultural and social profile. Mike is here today for a 45-minute speech or so that will be very interactive, no projection. So very likely there will be questions for you, not for Mike. I hope you will enjoy this fantastic opportunity to learn about the world in which we live, the perspective of the economy, and the social trends in our planet. And I think Mike is the right person to open our eyes in this respect. Thank you, Mike, for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Roberto. I'm thrilled to be here, actually. My wife, Juliana, is a journalist and met Roberto at the Ambrosetti conference, I guess. It's hard to get invited to, but anyway. And they had a great conversation, and I thought I better get myself down here and find out what all you are doing. It won't surprise. I mean, I don't think in 45 minutes cover the global economy and what's going on. So I'll be a little bit selective about it. And I thought the right focus would be to tell you a little bit about the impact of what you and your colleagues around the world are doing in terms of how economies are functioning or what the challenges are that they face. So I'll tell you a story. A guy named, but at my age you forget names, a famous marketing professor at Harvard named Ted Levitt, wrote a paper in 1983 called The Globalization of Markets, in which he basically, his vision of what was happening is that the economics of business at the time was huge economies of scale driving costs down for a limited range of products, product differentiation being truncated by this massive benefit you get from scale. Going global, so the homogenization of taste, the rising income of developing countries. Very interesting vision. But it turned out that's not exactly what's happening. And I started thinking about it and talking to a friend of mine who's an entrepreneur in Hong Kong. And I started thinking, what did Ted Levitt not know that's second nature to all of you, that's relevant in economic terms? Well, it sort of sounds like this. China had started to grow, but was barely visible on the global scene. The economy was tiny, and nobody cared, and nobody thought it would grow at 10% for 30 years and become the second largest economy in the world. India really didn't start to grow until after a crisis in 1991. The internet existed, but it was really kind of invisible to anybody except your predecessors, that is the preceding generation, the academics and the defense people who used it. The World Wide Web was invented in 1989 and deployed for the first time in 1990 and kind of became visible and usable in the mid-90s. The first cell phone was produced by Motorola in 1983, the year Ted Levitt wrote the article. It weighed 5 pounds or something like that, cost $3,995, and you could talk for 30 minutes before it ran out of its battery. Now there are, I think, 7 billion cell phones in the world, and we're on a trajectory so that virtually everybody on the planet has them, even those in what are still very poor countries. And you could go on. 3D printing didn't exist. Robots were dumb, didn't have sensors, didn't have the learning ability that you're producing, and so on, and therefore had a limited range. So they were used in auto plants. And if a car came down the line, they'd rivet that. And if you put, a turkey on the line, they'd put a rivet in that. I mean, they just didn't matter. In other words, in 1983, virtually all those technological forces that are operating on the way societies run, the way economies are put together, the way labor markets work, and so on, were essentially non-existent or invisible. Technological and global market forces. So what do we have now? we've got a world that has the following characteristics. The developing countries started to grow, haltingly at first in the early part of the post-war period, but they're now really important. And it isn't just China. The developing world has about 85% of the world's population. They've now gotten to be over 50% of the world's total economy, measured normally by GDP, gross domestic product, only it's not domestic in this case. You've got a world that's out of balance, badly out of balance because of mistakes about the way markets work when they're not regulated. We could go into that, and we're kind of on a learning curve in this. You all live, at least right now, in a structure in Europe that's not properly put together, that's causing lots of problems, and it makes some other things that I'd like to talk about invisible, or not invisible, but harder to see. So let me take the American economy, which is a kind of put together as an economy. It's got lots of problems, but if a bunch of people at MIT started looking at employment in the United States economy, and what they found was that in the year 2000, there was an inflection point on the employment, the labor market side, and jobs that they called routine and that you would probably call codifiable, both white and blue collar, that is, both manual and processing of information or transactions and whatnot, started to drop like a stone. Right? Now, this is an economy that managed to generate enough employment until the crisis that we just went through a few years, 6 years ago. But it's pretty clear that with a lag, because people who invented these technologies, the internet, the connected databases, the processing of corporate information, the automation of supply chains and all that, could see it coming, but it really came very fast. And when you combine that with globalization, which is a process up till now of going around with the support of information technology and management innovation, finding underutilized valuable human resources and deploying them. And because labor, many of you come from all over the world, so at the level you're at, you're mobile. But labor is the least mobile thing in the world as compared with, say, capital, which flows easily, goods relatively easily, information, virtually no barriers at all. That's the story. And so a lot of what happened in the advanced economies is these other economies got good at doing certain aspects, certain functions in global supply chains, and the activity moved there, taking that employment with them. That's on what I call the tradable side of the economy. So now I'm going to bore you with one little technical thing, because it confuses people. And any economy consists of two parts when you think about its relation to the global economy. There's a set of things, goods and services that trade internationally. That set is getting bigger. We can now trade services that we couldn't practically trade 20 years ago. That's the internet, telecommunications, ICT effect. And that is dramatically expanded. That's one of the most rapidly growing parts of the global economy. The other part of any economy, including this one, is it's non-tradable, and it's huge. It's 2/3 of an advanced economy. And it's things like government, most of education, hotels, foods, restaurant, construction, a lot of things that maybe someday will become tradable, but right now they're not. So these forces that I'm talking about on the global side operated on the tradable side of the economy. What this has done, and I'll now focus on the technology, but a combination of, an internet with standardized protocols connected to all digital databases in the world with appropriate software infrastructure and the cloud and the coming Internet of Things and so on, essentially creates an environment in which you can disintermediate people. The classic examples are ATMs and so on, but it goes well beyond that. And that's produced this effect. And so what has happened in the physical world, it's robotics and 3D printing and other things that are underway and starting to be increasingly powerful. This has it has had two effects when you go look for them. One is pretty easy to see. It just displaced people in certain kinds of functions, and they have to either find work in another function or get retrained or something like that. And that process, I think, has barely started. The second effect is it dramatically pressures the income distribution in a way you would not want it to pressure it, because the jobs that are being taken out are essentially middle-income jobs. And so what's happening is that people are being pushed one way or the other. They work hard and get into the upper part of the education income spectrum, and they're doing spectacularly well in the global economy, or they get pushed down, into the lower value-added part of the economy, and there's a lot of people being pushed down, so they compete for jobs. And while this varies a lot from country to country, if you go look at the United States income distribution, the average income is going up at a reasonable pace. The median income, that is at the 50 percentile, hasn't moved in the last 15 years. and it looks like it's getting worse. So we have a big challenge in sort of reconfiguring or figuring out how to go through a process of reconfiguring the sort of human capital, if you like, of our economy so that it matches this rapidly moving demand side. If you're used to thinking in these terms, this is a market that may clear in the short run, but it's out of long-run equilibrium. That is, the supply side just can't keep up with the way the demand side is moving. And this is largely technological. The other effect I thought I'd mention is something that many of you may not have spent a lot of time thinking about, but in the post-war period, we saw growth of a type that we never saw before in the developing world. There are at least 13 countries that have grown at 7% or more a year for 25 years or more. That's a pretty high bar, right? At 7%, you're doubling every 10 years. And there'll probably be more, as more countries, join the party. That's produced the effects I talked about before. This process, one of the things I've found is that, and this probably doesn't happen to you because you're scientists and engineers, but people, don't think about growth and size sort of properly separately. So let me give you an example. In 1978, or not long after that, after Deng Xiaoping decided that central planning didn't work and they better try something else or the party was going to get kicked out, meaning the Communist Party, and decided they'd try what they actually did, which is to have at least some markets and incentives and decentralization and prices and so on. It worked spectacularly well, and shortly thereafter, the economy was growing at 9.5% to 10%, which then China is the outlier. It's the highest sustained growth process we've ever seen. So that happened, and then people sort of sat back and said, well, who cares? This isn't going to go on, or it's, a communist country or whatever. And it didn't matter. But it went on for 35 years, right? And now, when China grows at 6.5% and people are wringing their hands, that's the equivalent of Europe or the United States growing at more than 3%. And we're not growing at 3%. So the increment, what it means in terms of sort of the economic equivalent of mass is very different, once this is run for a long period of time. Another way to think about it is that you can do the math easily. But if you define a poor country as a country with a per capita income of, say, $500, and a middle-income country as one that's in the $5,000 range, and you start growing at high speed, let's say 7%, then you have to double once, that gets you to 1,000, double again to 2,000, double again to 4,000. We're just talking about decades here, okay? And then doubling once more, and you're in the middle-income area, and start to have economic mass. So when you look at a developing country, most of the time that it takes to get to the middle income level and then up to where we live, let's call it $20,000 a year at the bottom end, is spent in, going from poor to middle income. right? It's just the math, or it's exponential standard stuff for you. But most people don't think of it in those terms. So we're at the point where the developing world is now big and growing faster than we are because they're still in catch-up mode. That's a sort of shorthanded way for saying or explaining why you can get 7 or 8 or 9 or 10% growth. They got so far behind, in the 200 years since the British Industrial Revolution, that all you had to do was inbound transfer the sort of knowledge and technology base that had been developed in what we call industrialized or advanced countries, and the ones that were able to absorb it and invest at high rates were able to grow at rates that, and they will slow down, of course. They'll become like advanced countries, growing at 2-3% a year. And when we grow on the work that you do, right? This science turns into, technology and innovation, changes the total factor productivity of economies. And while there's lots of complexity in how this works in an economy, that's how we grow. And by the way, that's a shared activity. You all know this. I mean, you live in worlds where innovation comes from all over the place, and you know about it more or less instantly. and that process is a global activity. It's interesting you know it, but a lot of people, including economists, don't know it. So they fall into thinking that it's a sort of national activity. So that's where we are. I think the big challenge from a social and economic point of view is, how do I put it? I listen to a lot of talk about technology because it's so important now as a force in the economy, in the global economy and in individual economies. And the conversation tends to run in the direction of, is this a good or a bad thing in the long run? And I think that's not the right question. It's obviously a good thing in the long run. And even if it weren't, it's not going to stop. The right question is, this kind of technology disruption, if you want to call it that, or forced change, it creates difficult transitions, sort of for people, for economies, and so on. And the right thing I think we have to think about is how to make that transition that we're going to go through anyway as effective and, to use the term we use in development, inclusive as possible. What we don't want to do is have a bunch of people find that they don't have no place anymore in the kind of economic structure. Now, this isn't an exercise that somebody has a blueprint for and whatnot, so we got to kind of, learn how to do this over time. And this isn't unprecedented. Those of you who read literature and economic history will probably know that after the British Industrial Revolution, when England started to urbanize, it was really a chaotic process. I mean, cities were catastrophically poor places to live, and so on. It took about several decades before they kind of figured out how to make that model work from an economic and social point of view. But I will leave you with one thing, which is I think important for everybody to understand. When you have this kind of change, and you look at it from the point of view of the way an economy is put together, the technology and the global market forces force what we sometimes call structural change. That is, what an economy does, what kinds of jobs it creates, have to change. So they fit in their place somehow in the global economy. Economies are very different in how quickly or how resistant they are to structural change. The two most flexible large economies that I know of in the world are the United States and China. Germany is relatively flexible because of the reforms under the second Schroeder term, the 2003-2006. It's not as flexible as these others. Many European economies, some of the Nordic economies are quite flexible, and they've been practicing it for a long time because they're small, open economies, and they've kind of got used to the idea of being jostled around by the global economy. But many European economies are not flexible. And if you know the concept of a shadow price, basically if you constrain something, then you can ask, well, what do you get if you relax that constraint a little bit? And the answer to that is, in whatever metric you're using, it could be growth, it could be income, it could be anything that's in the maximization problem. That's the shadow price. In a relatively stable world in terms of technology and structure, the shadow price of constraints on structural change is relatively low. And so people sort of don't notice that there's a cost associated with that. But in periods where you're being forced to change fairly rapidly, that shadow price gets very large very quickly. And that's the kind of period we're in now. So economies that are going to resist change are going to experience slow growth and employment problems and so on. And I think you don't have to kind of read very far, to notice that that's the world we live in. So that's a kind of snapshot of where we are. I thought, rather than blather on about whatever happened to be in the middle of my head at this moment, what I'd do is stop and see if you guys have any gals and guys. Guys in America is a general gender-neutral term. Okay. Have any thoughts or questions or things that you wanted to talk about? Fire away. No?
What about if we add the energy inside the equation? So technology needs energy to be supported.
Yeah.
So, repeat just for
yeah.
What about technology needs energy to be supported, let's say. So what happens if we add energy consumption and energy supplies that are in the world now to the equation?
Well, it's a very important question. So, as I said, I couldn't really cover all of it. I'm glad you brought it up. My take on this, does anybody in this room know what fraction of the world's population lives in high-income countries? 15%, roughly. So the world we lived in, the world I was born into in the middle of World War II, no, it was World War I, sorry. Well, anyway, I'm so old that, compared to you guys, basically was a world in which there was this complete bifurcation. And I think I told you before, to me, the big story economically and socially is that the other 85%, after the collapse of colonial empires and the opening up of the global economy under the GATT, which has transformed itself into the WTO, and with this enormously powerful tailwind coming from technologies of a variety of kinds, they haltingly joined the party and are now, growing. And the two future economic giants of the global economy are China and India, because they're the most populous, 1.3 billion and 1.2 billion. There's more people in China and India separately than there is in all of the advanced countries now, which we're about 1 billion people if you add us all up. So a conservative estimate would be that the global economy will triple in size in the next 25 years, from $7 trillion now to, say, 200 plus trillion, something like that. And that may be a conservative estimate. And many of you in this room probably think that correctly, that there's some kind of sustainability problem the way the world's configured right now. Well, then you should be shaking in your boots with respect to the way it'll be configured two decades from now. So fortunately, with painfully long lags from the scientist's point of view, the rest of the world is sort of getting it. And getting it means we can't pull this off on the existing growth models. They cannot operate with the natural resource underpinnings on this model and get away with it. Whether it's climate change or water or eventually energy. The estimates are that we can get away with this on energy for too long with respect to climate change, probably till the end of the century. And that's too long for climate change. If we pull this off for another few years, probably 15, it'll be started to be irreversible and dangerous because of tipping points and so on. So the collective challenge that we have is to innovate and reinvent the sort of growth patterns, to use the Chinese term, so they're consistent with the natural resource base that we have. And we don't know if we're going to succeed in doing that. I can tell you in the early days of climate change discussion, after the scientists had made a convincing case that we just had to wake up and get on with this, that was hard. But who's going to do something about it's pretty hard too, because it requires, in the end, a global effort, and certainly the big players have to be in the game. So, if China's off doing their own thing, growing, and the United States is missing in action for whatever reason, having to do with the way Washington operates, it's kind of demotivating with respect to everybody else, because you can't win the game without the major players in the game. And the best behavior so far has come from Europe. Now, there are mistakes in detail, about how to go about this that are understandable and whatnot. But at least we're starting to make progress. But the early inclination was to think, well, we can't have those 85% people growing. We can't solve the problem at 3-4 times the scale. So why don't we just tell them that they can't grow? Well, that's a huge hit in Delhi or someplace like that. So that's not an option, right? They're going to grow. And they're going to increase their energy consumption, and they're going to increase their carbon output, and they're going to run into water problems. They already are, and so on. And so we're just, this is, and while there's measures we can take that have more to do with incentives and efficiency that we know how to do than we are doing now, we can make a lot of progress, but in the end, it's going to be technology that we either don't have or that's just in process that's going to get us to the end of this. I figure if you think of this as a 50-year journey where we either burn the place up or succeed, the first 20 we can get away with, energy efficiency and stuff like that. If you just look at the variance in energy efficiency across countries, they're huge, even advanced countries. So the United States is probably much less energy efficient and certainly much more carbon intensive per unit of GDP than virtually all of Europe. The outliers in this on a per capita basis are the United States, Canada, and Australia. I grew up in Canada. My Canadian friends say, well, it's cold up here. That's our excuse. That's BS, by the way. That stands for, never mind. That's BS. And so it's a very serious problem, and it's easy to get depressed about it. I thought when President Obama and President Xi Jinping actually made an agreement, were able to come to an agreement, that was a pretty good sign, and I think that motivated a little bit the meeting that was just held in Peru. And there's some chance there'll be some kind of global agreement in Paris, and that's real progress on that front. But it's a huge challenge. Probably on a very short list, one of the main ones. I would say that and global governance. We're operating in a global economy now that some of you may think that markets work great when they're not regulated. If what you're thinking when you think that to yourself is markets can be over-regulated, that is true. But unregulated markets, particularly unregulated financial markets, have very nasty tendencies, if I can put it that way. And so the notion is that basically you need regulation. When I was young, I was working on markets with sort of informational gaps and asymmetric information. You might think that's an esoteric topic, but actually financial markets, job markets, food, safety, drugs, right? It's a pretty long list of things where the buyer kind of doesn't really know all the characteristics of the product. And so we need to regulate markets. Now look at the global economy. Its network structure morphs. If you draw pictures of it, as economies develop and have different comparative advantage and connect to each other, it's kind of fun to watch. Physicists know how to draw these graphs, so we can now see it. But the point is that financially, in terms of the flow of goods and services, the flow of capital and all that stuff, it's increasingly densely connected But the markets themselves are only partially regulated, and when they're regulated at a national level. And we don't know all its characteristics, but it's a potentially unstable structure. So the other thing, I think, that I would put on the list, if we call the one you raised sustainability, is stability, is having a regulatory structure that matches, in some sense, the extent of the markets, which are increasingly global. Yes, sir.
When you started your talk, you said that Europe has been a success story, but done in the wrong way, and that this keeps certain problems hidden. So I would be interested in what problems these are.
Yeah.
And what do you think Putin's politics at the moment play for Europe? Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Because it seems to me that puts some pressure on how everyone else in Europe imagined the future of Europe. So I would be interested in that.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. That was pretty elliptical on my part. So Europe has been a success, and it's a very long-term project. And I've admired in the last few years when the stresses and strains showed up at how committed Europeans are to the project, even when it means, changing structures and navigating through tough times. And this is surely one of them. The thing that is structurally flawed is the way the Eurozone is put together, right? So you have a situation in which you have a monetary union and a central bank, but no common fiscal authority. There's no treasury for Europe. And people knew that in a variety of forms that was a structure that was designed to develop problems over time, and it did. So why did they do it? Well, the Germans didn't want to do it for whatever reason. They kind of liked having their own currency, I guess, although they benefit enormously because the euro for the Germans is an undervalued currency. For virtually everybody else, it's an overvalued currency, although that's fortunately finally started to change. I have to tell you, I look at these things as sort of part of my life. I think the chance of a sort of really robust recovery with a euro at 140, $1.40 to the euro are pretty slim, right? At 120, if we're getting there, it starts to get a little more manageable. And part of this was, anyways, that's the basic problem in the European thing, and because we're out of balance now, right? The adjustment mechanisms that are the sort of main ones in economics are missing in the Eurozone. That's why people talk about having a reasonable amount of homogeneity within a currency zone. So in Europe, for example, I have a fairly good working knowledge about how countries grow, what the role of government is, how investment affects it, and something like that. And it does. It has to do with public sector investment and structural flexibility and innovativeness and stuff like that. So if you look at the European economy kind of like this, or the Eurozone, well, you have a common currency and a central bank that's very competent but constrained to some extent. It has a very limited mandate, okay? And then you have a bunch of countries making decisions, some of which affect growth, like the tax policies, subsidies or tax favoring innovation, public sector investment in research, development, and all that kind of thing, all made in a decentralized way. So, voila. Countries end up in a different position. Well, that's not a good idea if you have the same currency, right? It's a very bad idea because it all turns into differences in productivity and competitiveness. And in a global economy where the entities are countries that have their own currency, if they get really out of bound, the currency resets the terms of trade. Only that can't happen in the Eurozone. Not only that, if you get overly indebted, wherever, and let's call it the government just for the sake of argument, you know that the debt to GDP ratio in Italy, gross debt, not net, but gross, is about 135% and rising. That's a pretty big balloon. If the yields in the sovereign debt market go to 7%, there's a question mark about whether we can pay our bills. So the ECB was very important because it stepped in 2012 and basically said, I don't care if you're George Soros, if you want to short the euro, I'm going to bet against you and you will lose, and the yields went back down, right? That's what happened. After 2 years of chaos in the sovereign debt markets, that saved us, so that's a success. But normally, if you're overly indebted, you have inflation. And the real burden of the liability that the debt represents declines faster as the higher the rate of inflation. Now, I'm not saying that economists think that inflation's a wonderful idea, but inflation at 2% doesn't make it happen very fast, and inflation in the Eurozone now is under 0.5%, and there's actually a risk of deflation. Deflation is dangerous because the central bank loses its power because of what's called the zero interest bound, right? So they can lower the interest rate, the nominal interest rate, to zero. The real interest rate is the nominal interest rate minus the rate of inflation, okay? If the rate of inflation is negative, then the real interest rate's positive even though the nominal rate's zero. And if the negative rate gets bigger in absolute terms, meaning more negative, the real interest rate goes up again, which is exactly what you don't want to happen. So they lose control, and in a deflationary spiral, the real interest rate keeps going up. And people keep postponing their purchases because it's going to be cheaper tomorrow. I mean, it's a disaster from an economic point of view. The big challenge right now for the central bank, the ECB, or BCE, excuse me, we're in Italy, is to stop this with an aggressive set of asset purchases. And hopefully the Germans and the other more conservative bodies will think that's okay if it becomes dangerous enough. But that's kind of where we are. Those are technical, kind of structural, putting it together issues that don't fundamentally alter the commitment on the European side to completing the project. But I have to tell you, I mean, if I get asked quite a lot, what are the growth prospects in Europe? They're not great for the next 3 to 5 years because there's no quick fix to this stuff. And they're big things to do. You need structural flexibility. You need a fiscal reform. Can I go on one more second about this? So the sovereign debt to GDP ratio in Italy is 135%. And then there's a bunch of things called non-debt liabilities. Think pensions, or in America it would be health care, right? Those are, if you go across developed countries, can be 3 and 4 times the sovereign debt levels. So the question is, why aren't they sinking? These are balance sheets, right? Roberto and I were talking about how you have to learn about balance sheets. And sustainability is a balance sheet issue. In a way, you're running down capital. It's just natural capital. Anyway, so these non-debt liabilities are big. So why is it hurting Italy so much and not so much the United States? And the answer is because we're younger. They're going to hurt the United States if we don't change the programs in about 10 to 15 years. These liabilities have what people who live in the bond world call a maturity structure, right? They come due at different points in time, 10-year bond, 20-year bond, and so on. Well, in Italy, they're coming due now, right? And that's a real huge problem, so that has to be fixed. So there's lots of, every economy is a different version of this, but that we have lots of challenges of that kind. And they're very hard things to do. I mean, if you say you go for labor market flexibility, you have to do it in such a way that there's a reasonable amount of trust that it won't be used on the corporate side as an excuse to get rid of a lot of people with no compensating benefit in terms of social security, growth, job creation, and so on. So you need a package that's kind of convincing. And if you start out with people kind of not trusting each other, on the management union side, it's just very difficult to get the whole thing done. We have a young man in Rome who's working on it, and we'll see. Yes, sir.
I'd like to know, according to you, your point of view on
Obama, yeah.
I'd like to ask you, what will be, according to you, the role of the United States in let's say, medium and long term world economy, and if President Obama, especially the last Obama government, is doing the best for the United States economy?
It's a very good question. So one of the things that's difficult for the United States is that it has been dominant and maybe at times a bully, and it's losing its dominance. And that's a difficult, it's more psychological than anything else. You just don't get your own way as much because you're not big enough. We could go down that road. I mean, one of the things that confers economic power is a big market that people want to have access to. So none of the developing countries had any power in economic terms because they didn't have a big enough market to matter. The ones that were growing, like South Korea and Taiwan, they couldn't threaten, Europe or America or Japan by saying, you can't sell stuff in this market. South Korea has 40 million people, and they'd say, well, geez, that's really scary. China has a lot of power now. It's a very, very big market, and if you get blocked out of it, I'm not saying they're going to block people out, but if you get blocked out of it, there's real trouble, right? It is the only important part of the thing. It's growing very fast. So power is shifting, and that's hard for the United States, and I would say we're behind the curve. That is, the reality is at variance with what the majority of Americans and even the majority in Congress think. So they're acting as if it was the world we lived in, 10 and 20 years ago, even though it's not. And I guess it's going to come as a shock that we can't kind of make the rules anymore. The second part of that is if nobody is big enough to make the rules, then it's harder to make the rules. That is, a multipolar world is a harder one to govern because you actually have to agree on it, and they're very different. I mean, in terms of governance structure, stage of development, income level, and et cetera, it's just harder. It's more complex. So that's where we are. No, I mean, the recovery in America is largely attributable to the central bank, however you come out on whether they've been too aggressive or not. I mean, this is, a fun debate for economists and other people with some important implications. I mean, if they keep this up, they're going to keep asset prices sort of elevated and deviating from the economic fundamentals, and that's not necessarily a good or sustainable thing. But the American government, whether it's fiscal policy or just getting stuff done, has been, from most people's point of view, a disappointment. That is, management issues have come up over and over again, whether it's the implementation of the healthcare law or responses to crises and so on, or an aggressive fiscal complement to the monetary stimulus we got, or anything else. Part of the reason the monetary part got so aggressive was that the fiscal part wasn't very aggressive at the start and then reversed. If you look at the American economy, it was really the private sector and the innovative part and the structural flexibility that helped us with the growth. The government started pulling back because of this tug-of-war between the left and the right. So government was a positive stimulus for a while, then a negative drag for a while. Now it's neutral because the budgets are back more or less in control, including state and local ones. So, I would say, and it shows in the polls. I mean, in many countries, the government is not viewed favorably, and it's definitely true of the United States. So all of those things are going on at once. And, you wonder. I mean, it's a pretty complicated global economy. Not everybody can spend their time flitting around sort of learning about it and, figuring out where everybody's coming from, and I think people get confused. But it's not been our best patch. Yeah, there's a gentleman at the back, way up at the top. Oh, okay, well, all right. When we get the mic to you, I'll do this first, and then you're next.
Sorry.
Yes, hi, fire away.
So you mentioned several times about China. So going back to the technology impact on the society, I'm wondering whether you can give us some hints how China in particular is, which kind of strategy is China adapting to basically face with this issue of the very expensive technology and the average level of education in the country, especially of the young generation?
It's a very good question. So China's in a very complex transition. It's called the middle income transition. And it's harder for them because they're so big and whatnot. But basically, the answer, I think the best answer to the question is China's lucky, and for the following reason. They are at a stage where the technologies that, including ones that you're developing, and I'm going to go look at in a few minutes, are going to be an important part of the way they play in manufacturing and the global economy. That is, it's exactly the right moment. To be precise, in case you're forming companies with these products, I have a friend who thought, what are these companies that are doing labor-intensive, sort of process-oriented assembly going to do? And the answer is they're either going to go abroad to an earlier stage developing country. There's a more complicated version of this. Some of them will go inland, where the infrastructure is okay, but the incomes are still low, or they'll become digitally capital intensive. So he went up to Shanghai, which is one of the biggest ports, probably still the biggest port, and he said, "What are our companies importing?" And the answer was robots, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of robots. It won't happen overnight, but that's what's going to happen. The harder question is really isn't China; it's the earlier stage developing countries, because if the digitally capital-intensive technologies that you and others are developing become powerful enough, they'll essentially, you won't be able to compete with them on cost and quality, no matter how low the wages, or the incomes in the country. At which point, if you think about it in sort of geographic terms, I said before, the global economy spent most of its time moving toward labor and valuable human resources in various categories, highly educated, educated okay, but not terribly skilled, and so on. That'll just stop, and the physical processes associated with these technologies will move toward markets. Why will they move toward markets? Because it's better, it's more efficient. If you have to move something physical, you want to be near the market. And the extreme case of that is 3D printing. So 3D printing, when it becomes a manufacturing technology, will become unlike any other technology where you produce to forecast demand. It'll be produced on demand, right? It's very different. There won't be any inventories except, the inventory associated with getting the thing from wherever the printer is to wherever it's supposed to be, and that won't be a long distance, I don't think. And the people in the supply chain world, have got it. They've figured this out. They don't exactly know where it's going to take them. So that's what I think is going to happen. And the Chinese economy, at the public sector level, is going to have to make massive investments in education, upgrading universities, improving the quality, and so on, in order to manage this. There's still almost half the population in the rural areas in China. So that would be 650 million people. And the old growth model produced those jobs in large numbers in the tradable sector, i.e. the ones that are about to get displaced on a time scale we don't exactly know. So question is, does that kill off, this is an urbanizing process, as you well know. What happens? Where's the employment engine? And I think the answer, if it all goes well, is that the employment engine is in the urban service, labor-intensive urban service sectors, rather than the export sector. But that's kind of in process, and we're not sure it's going to work. But anyway, that's kind of where they are. The anti-corruption campaign is designed to get rid of China. From imperial days, China is run by a bureaucracy with people selected on a highly meritocratic basis. It looks, in a very odd way, it looks a lot like France. But it got corrupted in the 10 years prior to this administration with lots of relationship, exclusive access to transactions and to markets and stuff like that. And the population was getting extremely unhappy with this trend, because they've always viewed the Communist Party as they're allowed to make mistakes, but they weren't allowed to sort of, be lining princelings' pockets and their relatives. So this is a pretty important campaign that they're undertaking to kind of restore, in some sense, the authority and credibility of the party. Because they're not going to change the governance structure right now, probably for another 10 years or so, I would imagine. Yeah. Yes, sir. Do you have the mic? No. Turn it on.
Maybe now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, sorry.
Good.
Going back to Europe, there's been an increase in Eurosceptical people due to the lack of growth and lack of, low job creation rates and so on. What would happen if one of the European countries would just quit the European Union?
You mean the Eurozone?
Yeah, the Eurozone and the Union itself.
Yeah. Well, so we may have Britain quit the Union. I hope that doesn't happen, but that's less dramatic in some sense than the Eurozone, because the Eurozone is actually knit together around the currency. That would be chaotic, even if it was a small country like Greece. It would be very hard to predict, but a huge amount of downside risk in financial markets and economic performance. So I think you're right. I mean, there are Eurosceptics, and they are partly responding to the poor economic performance now, and I think they're also responding to the feeling that people have that they used to live in communities where they had a sense of what controlled their lives, and increasingly people have a feeling that they're living in a system where they don't know and have no real influence on the big things that affect them and their lives and their employment opportunities and the opportunities for their kids and stuff. And that's, I think, something that has to be taken seriously. And, the way that gets talked about in Europe is to sort of modernize the democratic structures so that they actually respond to this fairly deep need in people to feel like they live in an environment that, is trustworthy and under control somehow. And it's just a kind of scary place right now, I mean, I tell people in North America who sort of don't get it, the youth unemployment rate, not controlled for, in terms of education level, is 3% now in this country and a number of others. That's close to having a kid with, at my age, or a grandson or daughter. There's a 1 in 2 chance of getting a job. That's not great. And I don't think we can kind of keep doing that for very long without having consequences in terms of rejection of the whole structure. So I think it's a serious problem. I don't think it's going to happen overnight, but partly because of the history means that European integration has a much deeper meaning than just economic integration. But still, it's not infinitely resilient with respect to structural flaws and poor economic performance and this sense of loss of control. That's kind of where I am on that. Yes, sir.
Back to monetary union.
Yep.
I wonder, maybe there's some confusion about what Eurozone is and European Union is, because I listen sometimes people,
they go back and forth. That's true.
Back to monetary union. I know there's some confusion about people thinking that Eurozone and European Union are the same thing. It's not, actually.
No.
And what do you think about the two EMS, the European Stabilization Mechanism, and the European Solidarity Manifesto that was signed by many colleagues of yours, about the opportunity of a strong competitive country like Germany to leave the Eurozone first and then to start to control the solution of the Eurozone in order to let the less competitive countries of the Southern Europe to have the opportunity to grow again?
So I think the second idea is actually a terrible one. I mean, I don't know what you'd have left if Germany said, for the good of the Eurozone, we're leaving. I mean, it doesn't kind of ring true. And Now, I know what they're thinking, and you know what they're thinking, too. If you get rid of the Germans and their current levels of productivity, then the exchange rate would adjust and make it easier for... You'd reduce the heterogeneity in relevant dimensions in the Eurozone as it's configured right now. But I honestly don't think that's the answer. I think the answer is holding it together, using its collective fiscal capacity to stimulate demand, because a lot of this is just demand-constrained growth. But you know what I mean by demand-constrained? I mean, when an economy is growing, it can have productive potential that's larger than what it's actually outputting, and what's constraining that is demand. So sometimes economies are constrained by demand, and sometimes they're constrained by their productivity levels. That's demand's fine, but they just can't produce anymore. And if they try, they'll get inflation. So Europe is demand constrained, and I think that's fixable. And you could have higher inflation for a while, especially in Germany, and that would help because competitiveness really has to do with, if you flatline wages and incomes on the tradable side in a country that's become uncompetitive, then it'll converge to a competitive position faster the higher the rate of inflation is in the country that's at the high end of the productivity thing. Now, you can say this is unlikely, but if you compare it to blowing up the Eurozone, then I think, you're back to, this is a very difficult situation. It's going to be hard to deal with, but it was more a kind of cute economist's answer to solving the problem of the absence of adjustment mechanisms, namely inflation and the exchange rate. Those are the two things that are missing. If Italy had its own currency, we could run the inflation rate up. We'd have our own central bank that actually controlled the money supply and the interest rates. We could run the rate of inflation up, in a responsible, stable way, right? And there's for sure, the Italian version of the euro would reset downward a little bit. But I want to say this carefully. One of the things you learn in developing countries is devaluation is not a growth strategy. It's a way to get poor. What it is if you get out of line, it's a good way to reset the system. And so you don't have to go through the painful process of deflating your way back to kind of competitive positioning. Do you understand what I mean on the tradable side? So that's kind of, I think, where we are. It's tough, but it's... Go ahead.
Yeah, but apparently then the only choice we have now is to lower wages to people because we can deflate, we can print the market.
Well, don't forget, I don't know, you guys probably don't spend all your days thinking about this because you have more productive things to do, but in a country like Italy, what you want to do is lower the cost of employment, okay? That's not the same thing as wages, right? There's this huge thing, which is, what, right? There's ways to do that. One is the efficiency of government. Parts of it are a marvel. In the north here, I think the healthcare system is pretty impressive, to put it mildly. And there's lots of strengths, but there's clearly excess costs in there. Secondly, I think the tax system is nuts. Now, I would say that same about the United States, but for a different reason. If you have a big employment problem, you don't want to have a set of taxes that tax what amounts to employment highly. And you might say, well, what's the alternative? Well, you can tax assets, like property. So Italians get all upset about the shifts in the property tax here. I got to tell you, your property taxes or ours, excuse me, I live here and own a piece of property. Ours are minuscule. I have a condominium in Florida, which is kind of my American home, where I would say the property tax is 10 times the property tax on the property in Milan, and its valuation in the market is lower. Well, it used to be lower. Mine's going down, and Milan's going down pretty fast. But so there's all kinds of things. I think when I listen to, the talk shows, Ballero and so on, I think, what the hell are they talking about? This doesn't have anything to do with anything. I think it's political theater. And I don't mean to be critical. I mean, you can say the same nonsense occurs in a whole lot of different places. So Don't take it the wrong way. But in terms of focusing on how you might get this done, I don't think the public policy debate, as far as it intersects what people in the population think about, has much to do with the reality that we're facing. At least it seems pretty disconnected to me. But yeah, if you get out of line, then pretty minimal or flat wage and income growth can be part of the answer. That was part of the answer in Germany, and only they did it on purpose. And you know what the deal was? The deal was Labor said, I understand, right? First, we got to let that stuff go to Eastern Europe. It doesn't belong here. The economics works in that sense. And they had arrived, and they had labor, and they had infrastructure, and so on. We have to move into the higher end, products and so on. And we understand that, if we have flexible markets and labor markets, we can generate more employment. But the fact that you couldn't fire me or close my plant was part of my Social Security, so it has to be rebuilt in another way. All of these things, get thrown into the hopper as part of the process of sort of adjusting. But the other thing Labor said was very interesting, because they have government and business and labor sitting on the management things in major German companies. So Labor said, we understand about the muted wage and income growth, but that doesn't mean us. It means us and you. And if you go look at the income distribution in Germany, they largely honored that. Now, I think it's sort of breaking down now. But to a great extent, they made a deal with each other that everybody was going to share this burden for the time it took to put the economy in competitive condition. It was a pretty impressive collective process, I think. Any more? Yes, sir. I guess this is the last one. I think you got to get me out of here.
About the crisis we're going through in this moment. In public talks and newspaper, normally you tend to think that a lot of people think this is just a cyclical crisis we're going through. And a lot of these guys are talking about typical measures to get out of this crisis.
Right.
A lot of other guys think this is not really a cyclical crisis, something more structural. You need to change something radically to get out of this. Yeah. The question is where we are now. I mean, is this a cyclical? So doing nothing, like a lot of guys are saying, we will get out one way or the other. Or do we really need to do something quick and something strong to get out of this crisis? And is the research, the technology, and also research you guys are doing on other fields like economics can help in this? I mean, how can we reinvent, or do we really need to reinvent in some way the system to get out of this?
So I think the answer is yes. I mean, basically, there's nothing even vaguely, sorry, that's too strong. There's a cyclical component to this, but there's at least two other components. One is economies are out of balance because they were growing the wrong way coming into the crisis. That takes different forms in different countries, but most of them have something to do with leverage. Okay, in America, we basically levered up the household sector, and they consumed more than they could afford, and then the market crashed, and the housing, market crashed, and so on, and we stopped. So we had a sudden shock, and people still thought it was cyclical, but there'd been an enormous amount of balance sheet damage, and what has partly held demand down, okay, is people have to save more, so they can retire, because the balance sheet damage was pretty severe. I mean, people bought houses at prices they never should have, had mortgages that were higher than the current value of the house, and so anyway, you can see that. I mean, you can do the math, but anyway, so it was a balance sheet recession. It was also big damage in the financial sector's balance sheets. In this country, that we levered up the public sector side because debt was cheap, because everybody thought that, sovereign debt was the same as German sovereign debt, which is wrong in terms of... Must have been my cell phone. And so that's a second component, makes it non-cyclical. And the third component is, I think, what you're referring to, and what I've been trying to say is the global market forces and technological forces, even without a crisis and imbalances or anything cyclical, would be forcing the change anyway. And if we resist the change, we'd be slowing down and having employment problems. So on all three counts, I think it's complicated, so it's hard for people to get their minds around it. But the reality is that there's at least two important dimensions in which it's non-cyclical. One, imbalances like excess leverage and whatnot that take time to heal. And then these other very powerful forces that are associated with the kind of work you do here, which are, in the end, they're marvelous, but the transitions are hard. And the old notion that globalization produces positive benefits is still true, massively true, but the proposition that everybody benefits in the transitions is not true. And you can see that, right? So it's the transitions that we have to worry about. I don't know how dramatic one wants to be about this. I guess I wouldn't say. You wouldn't want to tell people we have to sort of invent an entirely different way of thinking about how economies function and grow. That would be too dramatic. And I just think working on the things that we know work. I mean, the problem is fairly simple. When I go around developing countries and ask, why are they growing slowly? The ones that get stuck in a no-growth equilibrium. There are a lot of them, right? There's 180 countries in the world, and, a lot of them aren't growing very fast or are just stuck. That's why there's still a lot of poor people on several continents. So I asked myself, well, what are the reasons why we see this, given that there's clear cases of growing at 7, 8, 9%, with huge benefits in terms of poverty reduction, opportunities for your children and grandchildren and other things people care about. And the answers, I think, are two. One, it's governance sometimes. If you have a government that's busy lining its pockets, or fighting with somebody or, making sure that some subgroup benefits at the expense of others, absolutely nothing good will happen in terms of economic performance. That's just fatal. And that's the most common. It's a governance failure of whatever kind. And there's a whole field of political economy, including many distinguished scholars here in Italy, who think about this all the time. On purely economic grounds, there's a simple answer. It's just flat-out underinvestment. So an economy that's going to grow at 7% has to be investing well over 25% of its GDP on both the public and private sector side. I won't bore you with what the mix should be, because we don't know it very precisely. But you can't do it without public sector investment. If you don't have ports and infrastructure and telecom infrastructure and so on, you just ain't going to happen. And ditto, the driver of growth is so what that does, that public sector investment, is it raises the return to private sector investment, and then that starts the engine running. And underinvestment is the most common explanation. And I think we're still doing it, right? I mean, not just in developing countries, but advanced ones. So in the United States, it's pretty clear we're underinvesting in infrastructure. It's falling apart. It's a disgrace. I mean, the richest country in the world, with airports like, LAX and stuff. I mean, don't get me going, but I mean, it's just that's what's going on. So we got to reverse that. And in periods, the worst time to underinvest is in periods of rapid change, because you need to be investing in people's skills, and they need to be investing in their skills and education and on the things that support the kind of thing that you do. So this is pretty impressive. This is a big investment. And you just need a lot of it to sort of sustain the whole system. Anyway, I think that's kind of what's falling short right now. You going to kick me out?
Mike, thank you very much for this exciting presentation. So we hope you're back in the near future. I give you a question for your next presentation. If we put in the story the war at the cost of 1 billion per day, approximately the high-tech war today, and if you can give us in the future some idea, consideration about the role of war in economy, I understood that destruction is localized and reconstruction deals with few people. The other model would be, let's use this money to do something better for everybody. But this is another point. You will tell us next time we meet. Okay. So thank you again for coming, Mike. Thank you very much.